Watch the seam where the two responsibilities met, because the seam is where the failure began. And the seam is the kind of structural vulnerability that no amount of fortification can address once it has been correctly identified. Along the section of the border where the Belgorod defenses were arranged, the responsibility for the area was divided between two distinct command structures that had grown up around two distinct conceptions of what the border was. One structure understood the border as a security problem, a matter of controlling crossings, monitoring movement, and managing the kind of low-intensity incursions that border regions experience. The other structure understood it as a military problem, a matter of defending against organized force operating with the equipment and coordination of a regular army. The two structures had different procedures, different communications, different chains of authority, and different assumptions about what they were defending against. Where their areas of responsibility met, those differences did not resolve into a coherent defense. They created a seam, and the Ukrainian planning that addressed the Belgorod sector had been studying that seam for considerably longer than the defenders had been thinking about it as a vulnerability rather than as an administrative boundary. This is not a story about Ukrainian forces overwhelming Russian border defenses through force. This is a story about what happens when a defensive arrangement that evolved to handle one kind of threat is confronted with a different kind of threat that exploits the assumptions the arrangement was built around, and how the failure of such an arrangement reveals the difference between defending a line and defending against a specific opponent who has studied how the line was actually constructed. I have spent decades studying how defensive systems fail at their boundaries, and I want to be precise about something at the outset. Defensive failures rarely occur where the defense is strongest, because that is where the defender's attention and resources have been concentrated. They occur where the defense is structured around an assumption that the attacker has identified and prepared to exploit, and the boundaries between command responsibilities are among the most reliable locations for such assumptions to exist, because boundaries are where coordination is hardest, attention is most divided, and the responsibility for any given problem is most likely to be assumed by each structure to belong to the other. What unfolded across the Belgorod sector is a case study in that kind of boundary failure. And by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand why the seam mattered more than the fortifications, why the responses available to the defenders were constrained by the same divided structure that produced the vulnerability, and why the most dangerous condition for any defensive arrangement is not facing a strong attacker. It is being arranged around assumptions that a studying attacker has identified before the defenders have recognized them as assumptions at all. Let me be direct about the original miscalculation, because it was not made by the personnel manning the Belgorod defenses or by the local commanders responsible for them. It was made at the level where decisions about the structure of border defense were made, in the assumption that the division of responsibility between security and military command structures was an administrative arrangement that would not become an operational vulnerability. That assumption reflected the reality of the border region for most of its history. The border had been a security problem far more than a military one, and the structures that had grown up to manage it had been appropriate to the problem it had presented. The principle was sound within the conditions under which it developed. The problem is that the conditions changed, that the border region became an operational military space rather than a security space, and that the structures appropriate to the security problem were not reorganized to address the military problem with the urgency the changed conditions required. The defense of the Belgorod sector was being conducted by an arrangement that had been appropriate to a different kind of threat against an opponent who had identified the gap between the arrangement and the actual threat and had prepared specifically to exploit it. Here is what the Ukrainian planning against the Belgorod sector had actually been developing in the period preceding the operation. And this is where the analysis begins to matter. The Ukrainian preparation had not focused primarily on the fortifications themselves, the physical defenses that the security and military structures had jointly constructed along the border. It had focused on the coordination architecture that was supposed to integrate the two structures' responses into a coherent defense. Which structure was responsible for which category of threat? How the two structures communicated when a threat crossed the boundaries of their respective responsibilities. Which decisions required coordination between them, and how long that coordination took. Where the gaps in coverage existed because each structure assumed the other was responsible for them. The Ukrainian intelligence picture of the sector was built around understanding the defense as a coordination problem rather than as a fortification problem, and that understanding revealed vulnerabilities that an analysis focused on the fortifications would have missed entirely. The defense was strong where each structure's responsibility was clear and where each structure had concentrated its resources. It was weak where the responsibilities overlapped or where each structure assumed the other was managing the problem. And the weak points were the points the Ukrainian operation was structured to exploit. This is a principle that every serious student of defensive warfare must internalize. A defensive arrangement involving multiple command structures derives its effectiveness from two things working together: coverage and coordination. Remove either and the arrangement fails to provide the integrated defense that the presence of multiple structures is supposed to deliver. An arrangement with adequate coverage but inadequate coordination has the resources to defend the area but cannot integrate those resources into a coherent response to a threat that crosses the boundaries between the structures. An arrangement with strong coordination but inadequate coverage can integrate its response but lacks the resources to make the integrated response effective. The Belgorod defense had coverage that, measured by the resources committed across the sector, appeared adequate. What it lacked was the coordination to integrate that coverage into a coherent response to an operation specifically designed to cross the boundaries between the responsible structures. The fortifications were present, the forces were present. What was absent was the coordination architecture that would have allowed the present fortifications and forces to respond to the Ukrainian operation as a single integrated defense rather than as two separate structures, each assuming the other was managing the part of the problem that fell outside its own clear responsibility. But this is only part of what made the Belgorod failure consequential beyond its immediate scope, because the Ukrainian operation had not simply identified the seam between the structures. It had structured the operation specifically to ensure that the seam would be tested faster than the coordination between the structures could respond. There is a distinction in modern operations between attacking a defense and attacking the coordination that holds a defense together, and the Ukrainian planning against the Belgorod sector had clearly been operating on the latter principle. The operation was timed and positioned to develop across the boundary between the two structures' responsibilities, ensuring that neither structure could address it within its own authority and that an effective response would require coordination between them at a speed that the coordination architecture had not been built to provide. By the time the two structures had begun to coordinate a joint response, the Ukrainian operation had already exploited the gap that the coordination delay had left open, and the response, when it finally achieved coordination, was responding to a situation that had developed past the point where the coordinated response could restore it. This kind of operation is harder to execute than it sounds, and the execution required intelligence preparation that exceeded what an operation focused on the fortifications would have required. The Ukrainian planners had to understand not just the physical defenses, but the bureaucratic and procedural relationships between the structures defending them, which is a category of intelligence that is harder to develop and that most defensive assessments do not even consider as a vulnerability. They had to identify the specific points where the boundaries between responsibilities created gaps, and they had to time the operation to develop through those gaps at a pace that exceeded the coordination capacity of the structures involved. The Ukrainian command and control during the operation demonstrated an understanding of the Russian defensive arrangement that the Russian arrangement itself had apparently not fully developed about its own vulnerabilities. And that asymmetry of understanding, the attacker understanding the defense's structural weaknesses better than the defender did, was the decisive factor in the operation's success. What happens when a defensive arrangement fails at the seam between its constituent structures reveals the relationship between organizational structure and operational effectiveness that defensive doctrine often underweights, and it deserves careful attention. When the Ukrainian operation developed through the seam, neither structure responded as if the threat was fully its own, because the threat was developing in the area where each structure's responsibility was ambiguous. The security structure addressed the elements of the threat that fell within its conception of a security problem, and the military structure addressed the elements that fell within its conception of a military problem. And the elements that fell between the two conceptions were addressed by neither until the coordination that should have integrated the responses had been established. The delay in establishing that coordination was the window in which the operation achieved its effect, and the delay was not a failure of individual judgment by the commanders of either structure. It was a structural consequence of the arrangement itself, which had divided the responsibility in a manner that made rapid, coordinated response to a boundary-crossing threat difficult by design. The defenders did not fail to respond. They responded as their structures were arranged to respond, and the arrangement was the vulnerability. And it gets worse from here, because the Russian command, when the failure at the seam became apparent, responded with the measures that competent military leadership applies in such conditions. Forces were committed to address the penetration. The coordination between the two structures was elevated to higher levels of authority, where the boundary between their responsibilities could be overridden by a common commander. Reserves were moved to seal the gap that the operation had exploited. None of this was incompetent. It was the response of a system that recognized it was facing a serious penetration and was attempting to apply the available levers to contain it. The problem was that the elevation of coordination to higher authority, which was the correct response to the structural problem, took time that the developing situation did not provide, and the higher authority, once engaged, was working to coordinate structures that had not been organized to operate under unified command, and whose procedures, communications, and assumptions did not integrate readily, even under the pressure of a common commander attempting to impose integration. The response was correct in its diagnosis of the structural problem. It was constrained by the same structural problem in its execution, because the coordination it was attempting to impose was being imposed on structures that had been built specifically not to require it. This is the doctrinal payoff I want every viewer to focus on, because it is the lesson that extends far beyond Belgorod and this war. The organizational structure of a defense is itself a component of the defense, and a vulnerability in the organizational structure is as exploitable as a vulnerability in the physical fortifications, with the additional difficulty that organizational vulnerabilities are harder for the defender to recognize because they are embedded in arrangements that the defender experiences as administrative reality rather than as operational vulnerability. The decisive variable in defending an area divided between multiple command structures is not the strength of the forces each structure commands. It is the speed and reliability of the coordination between them, particularly at the boundaries where their responsibilities meet. And that coordination is precisely the variable that divided command structures manage least well, because the division of command exists in tension with the coordination that integrated defense requires. The Belgorod defense was not weak in its forces or its fortifications. It was weak in the coordination architecture that was supposed to integrate two structures that had been built around different conceptions of the threat. And the Ukrainian operation had identified that weakness and structured itself to exploit it before the defenders had recognized it as a weakness at all. The broader lesson here must not be reduced to a story about Ukrainian capability or Russian failure, because that framing misses the structural point that makes the engagement instructive. The forces defending the Belgorod sector performed within the procedures their respective structures had established. The commanders of each structure responded as their structures were arranged to respond. The fortifications performed within the bounds of their physical capability. The failure was in the arrangement, in the division of responsibility that had been appropriate to an earlier conception of the threat and had not been reorganized to address the threat that had actually emerged. And that kind of failure is not unique to the Russian system. Defensive arrangements across many military establishments are divided between structures that grew up around different conceptions of the threats they were addressing, and the integration of those structures into coherent defenses against threats that cross their boundaries is a problem that most establishments have addressed in theory more thoroughly than they have addressed it in the practical reality of their command arrangements. The demonstration at Belgorod is a demonstration of what happens when the gap between the theoretical integration and the practical reality is identified by an opponent who has prepared to exploit it. The penetration has been contained at the cost of the ground that the failure surrendered and the resources that the containment required. The coordination between the structures has been reorganized, at least in the immediate sector, with the kind of urgency that follows the demonstration of a structural vulnerability that had previously been invisible. The assessments of how the failure occurred are being conducted, with results that will eventually feed into the broader question of how border defense should be structured against the kind of threat that has now demonstrated it can exploit the existing arrangements. But the questions raised by what occurred near Belgorod extend far beyond the immediate operational consequences, and they extend beyond this war. How many other defensive arrangements, divided between how many other command structures, are currently being maintained under the assumption that the administrative boundaries between responsibilities will not become operational vulnerabilities against an opponent who studies them? How many commanders are still measuring the strength of their defenses by the forces and fortifications committed to them, rather than by the speed and reliability of the coordination between the structures responsible for them? And how quickly can the lessons of Belgorod be absorbed by the institutions and armies that will face similar conditions in the conflicts ahead before they discover, the way the defenders of that sector discovered when the operation developed through the seam between their structures, that the boundary they had treated as an administrative arrangement had quietly become the most dangerous point in their entire defense, identified as such by an opponent who had been studying it while they had been treating it as something that did not require defending at all.